Winter, 1948. The Huaihai Plain disappears beneath a blanket of fog. Men stand motionless in the cold. Tens of thousands of them. Boots frozen to the earth. Rifles clutched in numb hands. Breath rising like smoke, then vanishing into silence. Somewhere beyond the mist, artillery rumbles. Distant, uneven, then stops. No orders come. These soldiers belong to the National Revolutionary Army, the largest, best-equipped force China has ever assembled. They were supposed to end this war. Instead, they are surrounded. Railways are cut, roads are gone, supplies that should have arrived days ago never come at all. Inside makeshift command posts, telephones ring unanswered. Field commanders wait for permission to retreat or attack. But headquarters is silent. Indecision spreads faster than hunger. Outside, the encirclement tightens. What no one here can yet see is that this battlefield will consume more than 500,000 men. Over 550,000 nationalist troops will be killed, captured, or surrender in these fields. Not in Beijing, not in Nanjing, but here, in frozen farmland, far from the capital. The fate of China is about to be sealed. By the time the fog lifts, the war will already be lost. And yet, this disaster did not begin in 1948. It did not begin with this battle or even with this war. Its roots reach back more than 20 years to a single decision, a single betrayal, when former allies turned their guns on each other and set China on a path from which there would be no return. So the question is not how this army was defeated. The real question is this: how did the most powerful army in China lose everything without realizing the war was already over? This is the war that created modern China. It is not merely the story of a civil war. It is the story of how China was remade, politically, socially, and psychologically, through more than 2 decades of nearly uninterrupted violence. To understand modern China, its power, its fears, its unity, and its limits, you must understand this war. Because between 1927 and 1949, China did not experience peace. It experienced collapse, layered upon collapse. The Qing dynasty had already fallen. 2,000 years of imperial rule ended not with reform, but with exhaustion. In its place came a republic that existed more on paper than in reality. The central government was weak. Regional warlords ruled vast territories like private kingdoms. Railways, tax systems, and armies answered to local strongmen, not to the nation. Foreign powers still occupied treaty ports along China's coast. Western banks controlled customs revenues. Japanese influence expanded year by year, mile by mile. For ordinary people, China was no longer an empire or a state. It was simply a place where authority changed uniforms, but suffering stayed the same. Out of this chaos emerged 2 movements, each claiming to be China's salvation. One promised national unity, order, and modernization through centralized power. The other promised revolution, land for the peasants, equality for the poor, and a complete break from the past. At first, they were not enemies. The Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and the Chinese Communist Party began as uneasy partners. They shared a common goal: to reunify China and end warlord rule. With Soviet assistance, they built armies together. They trained officers together. They spoke of a shared future. But beneath the surface, distrust was constant. The nationalists believed revolution must be controlled from the top. The communists believed revolution must rise from below. One side feared chaos. The other believed chaos was necessary. And when power finally came within reach, cooperation collapsed. What followed was not a single war, but a chain reaction of conflicts. Civil war, anti-communist purges, peasant uprisings, guerrilla campaigns, and foreign invasion, all overlapping, feeding into one another. Between 1927 and 1949, China would fight itself, fight Japan, then fight itself again. Cities would change hands repeatedly. Alliances would form and dissolve. Ideology would harden under pressure, shaped as much by survival as by belief. By the end, more than 20 million people would be dead. From combat, reprisals, famine, forced conscription, and displacement. Entire regions would be depopulated. Generations would grow up knowing nothing but war. And yet, from this devastation, a new order would emerge. A state forged by conflict, led by men who believed that compromise had nearly destroyed them, and that only discipline, control, and vigilance could prevent China from collapsing again. This war explains why China is ruled by one party, why political unity is treated as a matter of national survival, why dissent is feared not as disagreement, but as the first step toward chaos. It explains why Taiwan exists, the last territory held by the defeated government, separated not by ideology alone, but by the unresolved ending of this war. It explains why modern Chinese power is inseparable from ideology, because ideology was not debated in classrooms. It was tested on battlefields, in villages, and in mass campaigns where failure meant annihilation. This conflict reshaped East Asia. It influenced the outcome of World War II in the region. It laid foundations for the Cold War in Asia long before global lines were clearly drawn. And yet, nothing about its outcome was guaranteed. Again and again, the side that would eventually win stood on the edge of destruction. Its armies shattered, its leaders isolated, its future uncertain. At multiple points, defeat seemed not only possible, but inevitable. The survival of this movement depended not on overwhelming strength, but on retreat, adaptation, and time. Because the man who will ultimately declare victory in 1949 will spend most of this war losing ground, losing comrades, and losing battles. He will survive purges, encirclement, near total annihilation, and foreign invasion. He will outlast rivals who appear stronger, richer, and internationally recognized, and he will learn, earlier than anyone else, that in a war like this, endurance matters more than speed, and survival matters more than victory, because the man who wins this war almost loses it more times than anyone remembers. And to understand how that happens, how defeat becomes momentum, how retreat becomes legend, and how a fractured land becomes a new state, we must go back to the moment when cooperation turned into betrayal, when allies became enemies, and when China's long civil war truly began. To understand why China fell into civil war, you must first understand the world it emerged from. For more than 2,000 years, China had been ruled by emperors. Dynasties rose and fell, but the idea of a unified empire endured. In 1911, that continuity ended. The Qing dynasty collapsed under the weight of rebellion, foreign pressure, and internal decay. The last emperor abdicated. The throne vanished. But what replaced it was not stability. The new republic inherited a country exhausted by centuries of centralized rule, yet unprepared to govern itself without it. Power fractured almost immediately. Across China, generals who had once served the empire seized territory for themselves. They raised private armies, collected their own taxes, and ruled through force. China did not become a nation-state. It became a patchwork of personal kingdoms. Railways were controlled by whoever held the tracks. Cities changed hands without warning. Borders shifted not by law, but by gunfire. In the cities, a fragile modernity began to take shape. Shanghai, Tianjin, and Guangzhou filled with factories, banks, and foreign businesses. Electric lights glowed at night. Newspapers printed ideas from abroad. But beyond the cities, life remained brutal. In the countryside, the vast majority of China's population lived as peasants. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few. Debt passed from generation to generation. Bad harvests meant starvation. While cities talked of reform, villages struggled simply to survive. This divide between urban privilege and rural desperation would become one of the deepest fault lines in the coming war. China's weakness did not go unnoticed. Along the coast and major rivers, foreign powers maintained concessions, territories governed by British, French, Japanese, and other authorities. Chinese law did not apply there. Foreign gunboats patrolled Chinese waters. Customs revenues were controlled by international administrations. China's sovereignty existed, but only in fragments. Among these foreign powers, one advanced steadily and relentlessly. Japan, industrialized and militarized, viewed China as both opportunity and necessity. Its victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 had already stripped China of influence in Korea and Taiwan. By the early 20th century, Japanese influence spread across Manchuria through railways, businesses, and military garrisons. To many Chinese, Japan represented a future they feared, a modern state built through conquest. The result was humiliation and a growing conviction that China would not survive unless it transformed itself completely. It was in this environment that new political movements took root. One was the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. Founded on the ideas of Sun Yat-sen, the Nationalists believed China's salvation lay in unity. They called for a strong central government, national sovereignty, and modernization. To them, China's greatest enemy was fragmentation. Warlords, regionalism, and ideological division were threats that had to be crushed. Order, discipline, and state power were not optional. They were the only way to prevent China from disintegrating entirely. The other movement was smaller, poorer, and far more radical. The Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921, drew inspiration from Marxism and the Russian Revolution. But in a country where industrial workers were few, the communists adapted. They looked not to the factories, but to the countryside. They saw the peasantry, millions of landless farmers burdened by rent and debt, as the true revolutionary force in China. Land redistribution, class struggle, and mass mobilization became their core promises. Where the nationalists feared chaos, the communists believed upheaval was necessary. Where the nationalists sought to preserve order, the communists sought to overturn it completely. At first, these two movements did not fight each other. Facing powerful warlords and foreign threats, they formed an alliance. This uneasy partnership became known as the First United Front. With support from the Soviet Union, the nationalists and communists trained together, organized together, and launched a campaign to reunify China. Their armies marched north in what became known as the Northern Expedition, defeating warlords and bringing large portions of the country under nominal central control. To the outside world, it appeared that China was finally on the path to unity. But beneath the surface, mistrust deepened. The nationalists feared communist influence within labor unions and peasant movements. The communists feared that the nationalists would abandon revolution once power was secured. Each side believed the other was using the alliance only as a temporary necessity. Even as they fought side by side, both prepared for the moment the alliance would collapse. Political purges began quietly. Lists were made. Loyalty was tested. What looked like cooperation was, in reality, a countdown. They fought together, knowing they would one day fight to the death. And when that moment came, China would plunge into a war that would decide not only who ruled the country, but what kind of country China would become. Every civil war is shaped by forces larger than any individual, but it is decided by people, their beliefs, their fears, and the choices they make under pressure. In this war, 4 figures will shape China's fate more than any others. They do not begin as equals. They do not share the same vision of China. and they do not trust one another. Yet each is convinced of one thing, that history is moving in their direction. Chiang Kai-shek is a soldier before he is a politician. Born in Zhejiang province, he comes of age in a China humiliated by foreign powers and fractured by internal decay. He studies military discipline in Japan, absorbing not just tactics, but the belief that order must be imposed, not negotiated. To Chiang, chaos is China's greatest enemy. He rises through the ranks of the nationalist movement as a loyal lieutenant of Sun Yat-sen, and after Sun's death, he moves quickly to consolidate power. Chiang believes China can only survive if it is unified under a strong central authority. Regional autonomy, ideological diversity, and mass movements all appear to him as threats, seeds of disintegration. He trusts institutions. He trusts hierarchy. And above all, he trusts the army. But Chiang trusts people very little. Years of intrigue, betrayal, and assassination attempts convince him that loyalty is temporary and power is fragile. He keeps rivals close and potential enemies closer still. This distrust becomes his greatest weakness. As the war deepens, Chiang will command the largest armies, control the recognized government, and receive international support. But he will struggle to delegate authority, alienate capable commanders, and hesitate at moments that demand decisiveness. His greatest fear is losing control, and that fear will shape every decision he makes. Mao Zedong begins this war far from power. He is not a professional soldier. He does not come from an elite military academy or a prominent political family. Mao grows up in rural Hunan, surrounded by villages shaped by hunger, debt, and rigid social hierarchy. He watches landlords prosper while peasants struggle to survive. Where others see tradition, Mao sees oppression. As a young intellectual, he studies classical texts, modern political theory, and Marxism. But Mao's revolution is not born in factories. It is born in the countryside. He draws a radical conclusion that China's future will not be decided by urban elites, but by millions of peasants who have nothing left to lose. Again and again, Mao will argue against conventional military wisdom. Again and again, he will advocate retreat over confrontation, survival over victory. To Mao, time is a weapon. He is patient where others are reckless, flexible where others are rigid. When defeated, he adapts. When isolated, he reorganizes. Mao will lose battles. He will lose territory. He will lose comrades. But he will never lose sight of what he believes is inevitable, that power flows from those who control the countryside and those who can endure the longest. Zhou Enlai survives where others do not. Educated, articulate, and politically agile, Zhou moves easily between worlds that rarely touch. He understands ideology, but also understands people. While others lead armies, Zhou builds relationships. He negotiates alliances, manages internal disputes, and represents the communist movement to the outside world. In moments of crisis, Zhou becomes indispensable. He is not the most radical voice. He is not the loudest, but he is often the last one standing. Zhou's strength lies in his ability to translate revolutionary goals into practical action, to balance belief with survival. Through purges, defeats, and near-total collapse, he adapts without abandoning the cause. When compromise is necessary, he negotiates. When loyalty is tested, he endures. In a war that devours idealists, Zhou survives by understanding reality. Zhang Xueliang is born into privilege and tragedy. Known as the Young Marshal, he inherits control of Manchuria after the assassination of his father, a powerful warlord. He commands modern armies, controls vast territory, and enjoys international recognition. But Zhang is torn between loyalty to the nationalist government and responsibility to his own region. He watches as Japanese influence tightens its grip on Manchuria. He watches as the central government prioritizes fighting communists over resisting foreign expansion. To Jiang, the threat is clear and immediate. His frustration grows as orders from Nanjing clash with realities on the ground. And in a single, dramatic decision, he will force a confrontation that changes the course of the war. His action will shock the nation. It will humiliate Chiang Kai-shek, and it will reshape alliances at the most dangerous moment in China's history. But this war is not fought by leaders alone. It is carried on the backs of civilians. In the countryside, peasants are trapped between armies that demand food, labor, and loyalty. One side promises land reform. The other promises stability. Both demand sacrifice. In the cities, inflation spirals out of control. Corruption erodes confidence. Savings disappear overnight. For ordinary people, survival becomes political. Choosing sides is often not a matter of belief, but of which army arrives first. And as the war deepens, the distance between leaders and civilians grows wider. Each of these men believes he understands China. Each believes his path is the only one that can save it. They will cooperate. They will betray. They will hesitate. And they will act. And every one of them believes history is on their side. What they do not yet understand is how unforgiving history can be. By 1927, the alliance that had reunified much of China was already breaking apart. Outwardly, the northern expedition appeared successful. Warlord armies were defeated. Major cities fell under nationalist control. To many observers, the long period of fragmentation seemed finally to be ending. But beneath the celebrations, fear was growing. As nationalist forces advanced, communist influence spread rapidly in the cities they captured. Labor unions organized strikes. Workers armed themselves. Peasant associations expanded in the countryside. To Chiang Kai-shek, these developments were not signs of progress. They were warnings. He believed the revolution was slipping beyond his control. In Shanghai, China's largest and most strategically important city, tension reached its breaking point. The city was already a place of extremes. Foreign concessions operated under their own laws. Chinese workers labored in factories for long hours and low wages. Gang networks controlled docks, unions, and neighborhoods. Communist organizers had spent years building influence among workers there. By early 1927, armed labor groups controlled key infrastructure, including railways and power stations. For Chiang, this was intolerable. On April 12, 1927, he acted. Nationalist troops, supported by local militia and criminal organizations, moved through Shanghai in coordinated strikes. Union headquarters were raided. Known communist leaders were arrested on sight. Many were executed without trial. Bodies appeared in the streets, in alleyways, along riverbanks. Workers who had only days earlier celebrated victory were hunted down. The purge spread beyond Shanghai. In cities across China, communist members, sympathizers, and suspected supporters were arrested, imprisoned, or killed. The alliance was over. What followed became known as the Shanghai Massacre, and it marked the true beginning of the Chinese Civil War. For the Nationalists, the operation seemed decisive. Communist organizations in major cities were shattered, their leadership scattered or killed, their networks dismantled almost overnight. To Chiang Kai-shek and his inner circle, the threat appeared neutralized. They believed the war had ended before it had truly begun. But this was a fatal miscalculation. The communists had been unprepared for the speed and brutality of the purge. Many of their urban leaders were eliminated. Their vision of a city-based revolution collapsed in a matter of weeks. Yet not all were caught. Mao Zedong escaped. So did other survivors who had already begun to question the wisdom of relying on urban uprisings. Forced out of the cities, the communists retreated into the countryside, into regions where nationalist control was weak and government authority barely existed. What Chiang had crushed in Shanghai did not disappear. It transformed. In rural China, resentment had been building for generations: high rents, crushing debt, land concentrated in the hands of a few. Mao and his followers tapped into that anger. They organized peasant militias. They promised land reform. They framed the struggle not as politics, but as survival. What had begun as a political purge in the cities ignited a social revolution in the countryside. The Nationalists, confident in their victory, focused on consolidating urban power and defeating remaining warlords. They underestimated what was growing beyond the railways and highways. Small guerrilla bases appeared in remote areas. Local armed groups formed, then merged. Supply networks developed quietly. The countryside, long ignored, began to move. Looking back, this was the last moment the war could have been avoided. If compromise had followed the purge, if political integration had replaced annihilation, if fear had not dictated strategy, China might have been spared more than 2 decades of bloodshed. Instead, violence became the language of politics. The purge hardened positions on both sides. Trust vanished. Moderates were silenced or killed. From this point forward, neither side would believe coexistence was possible. The Chinese Civil War had begun. Not with a declaration, but with executions in the streets. And the consequences of that moment would echo for generations. In the aftermath of the Shanghai Massacre, the balance of power could not have been clearer. The Nationalists controlled China's cities. They commanded the railways, the ports, the arsenals, and the institutions of government. They possessed larger armies, international recognition, and access to foreign capital. The Communists, by contrast, were shattered. Their leadership had been decimated, their urban networks destroyed. Survivors were scattered, hunted, and cut off from one another. To many observers, the outcome seemed inevitable. A revolutionary movement without cities, without industry, and without secure supply lines appeared doomed to extinction. But ideology demanded resistance. In late 1927, communist leaders launched a series of uprisings, believing that speed and revolutionary momentum could compensate for weakness. The first was the Autumn Harvest Uprising. In rural Hunan and Jiangxi, peasant militias and defected soldiers rose against local authorities. The plan was ambitious: seize territory, inspire mass revolt, and ignite a nationwide revolution. The reality was brutal. Poorly armed and poorly coordinated, the insurgents faced experienced nationalist troops. Within weeks, the uprising collapsed. Survivors were executed or forced to flee into the hills. Later that same year came an even more desperate attempt: the Guangzhou Commune. In one of China's largest cities, communist forces attempted to seize power outright. Barricades were erected. Revolutionary committees declared control. For a brief moment, it appeared the revolution had returned to the city. Then, nationalist forces counterattacked. Artillery pounded urban neighborhoods. Street fighting left thousands dead. Within days, the commune was crushed. The lesson was unmistakable. Urban revolution in China had failed. The communists had underestimated the nationalists' military strength and overestimated their own influence among city workers. Repeated defeats left the movement on the brink of annihilation. At this moment, many communist leaders argued for continued urban struggle, believing that abandoning the cities meant abandoning Marxist doctrine itself. Mao Zedong disagreed. From the margins of leadership, Mao reached a different conclusion. China, he argued, was not Russia. Its cities were few. Its workers were limited in number, but its peasants were countless. Instead of fighting where the enemy was strongest, Mao proposed retreating to where the state was weakest. Instead of seizing cities, he would build power slowly in the countryside. It was a controversial decision, seen by some as cowardice, by others as heresy. But with few alternatives left, Mao acted. He led surviving forces into remote rural regions, establishing small base areas far from nationalist control. There, land was redistributed. Local militias were trained. Political education spread alongside military organization. The communists stopped trying to win quickly. They focused on surviving. This shift changed everything. The failure of the uprisings marked the end of one revolutionary vision and the beginning of another. From scattered bands of fugitives emerged a new kind of army, mobile, politically disciplined, and rooted in the countryside. The Nationalists, convinced they had crushed the revolution, turned their attention elsewhere. They did not yet realize what was taking shape beyond their reach, because retreat, once seen as defeat, would become Mao's greatest weapon, and from it, a far more dangerous revolution would grow. By the early 1930s, the war entered a new and more dangerous phase. The communists had survived, but survival had made them visible. Across south-central China, isolated revolutionary base areas had taken shape, the largest centered in Jiangxi province. Here, the communists governed territory, redistributed land, trained soldiers, and built what they called a Soviet state. To Chiang Kai-shek, this was no longer a scattered rebellion. It was an alternative China, and it could not be allowed to exist. Chiang responded with a strategy designed not for quick victory, but for annihilation. He ordered a series of encirclement campaigns, methodical operations aimed at surrounding communist-controlled regions and crushing them through overwhelming force. Nationalist troops advanced in waves. They built roads where none had existed. They fortified villages and crossroads. They cut off movement, supply, and escape. At first, the communists resisted successfully. Using mobility and local support, Red Army units avoided direct confrontation. They ambushed isolated units, withdrew before superior forces, and melted back into the countryside. These early victories reinforced Mao Zedong's strategy of guerrilla warfare. But inside the communist leadership, doubts grew. As the pressure intensified, influence shifted to leaders trained in the Soviet Union, men who believed that revolutionary legitimacy required conventional warfare. They argued that holding territory mattered more than avoiding battle. That retreat signaled weakness, that guerrilla tactics were no longer enough. Gradually, Mao's influence diminished. What followed was a fatal change in strategy. The Nationalists adapted. Under German military advisors, Chiang's forces abandoned rapid assaults in favor of a slower, deadlier approach. They constructed blockhouses, fortified concrete positions across the countryside. Each blockhouse supported the next. Every road was controlled, every village monitored. This was not a campaign of movement. It was a campaign of suffocation. Fields were seized or destroyed. Food was confiscated. Trade was cut off. The goal was starvation. Inside the communist base areas, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread. Morale collapsed. Attempts to break the encirclement through frontal attacks ended in disaster. Well-entrenched nationalist positions inflicted massive casualties. With each failed offensive, the Red Army bled. Leadership fractures deepened. Debates turned into accusations. Military setbacks became political liabilities. Trust eroded under constant pressure. By 1934, the situation was untenable. The communist base areas were shrinking. Their armies were exhausted. Ammunition was scarce. Food nearly gone. The decision that followed was not framed as retreat, but as survival. Under cover of darkness, the Red Army abandoned its strongholds. Equipment that could not be carried was destroyed. Wounded soldiers were left behind. What remained of the communist forces, fewer than 100,000 men, slipped through gaps in the encirclement. Behind them, the Nationalists claimed victory. From a military perspective, it was almost total. The communist state in Jiangxi was destroyed. The Red Army was shattered. starving, and on the run. To many, this was the end. But it was not annihilation. It was transformation. Because what followed this defeat, this near-total collapse, would become one of the greatest survival stories in military history. By the autumn of 1934, the communist movement stood on the edge of extinction. The Jiangxi Soviet was gone. The Red Army was exhausted, underfed, and badly outnumbered. Nationalist forces closed in from every direction. Total collapse was no longer a possibility. It was imminent. In October, the decision was made to move. What began was not a planned campaign, but a desperate escape. Columns of Red Army soldiers slipped out under cover of night, carrying what little they could. There were no clear maps, no secure supply lines, only a vague direction, west, then north, and the hope of survival. The Nationalists pursued relentlessly. Roads were blocked. Rivers were guarded. Every town became a potential trap. To avoid encirclement, the Red Army crossed some of the most unforgiving terrain in China. They marched through dense forests and deep swamps where men drowned in mud. They crossed icy rivers under fire, building bridges from ropes and planks. They climbed snow-covered mountains where oxygen thinned and temperatures dropped below freezing. Boots fell apart. Clothing rotted. Wounded soldiers were carried on stretchers until the carriers collapsed. Hunger was constant. Grain was scarce. Food was foraged from villages already stripped bare by years of war. Men survived on roots, bark, and whatever could be found along the road. Disease spread quickly through the ranks. All the while, Nationalist troops pressed close behind. Air reconnaissance spotted columns. Ambushes lay in wait at river crossings and mountain passes. Every delay risked annihilation. By early 1935, casualties were staggering. Entire units disappeared. Desertion increased. Confidence in the leadership eroded. It was in this moment of crisis that the communist leadership confronted its own failures. In January 1935, at the town of Zunyi, senior commanders gathered to reassess the disaster. The meeting marked a decisive turning point. Responsibility for the defeats was openly debated. Strategies based on rigid, conventional warfare were condemned. The authority of leaders trained in Soviet doctrine weakened. Mao Zedong spoke at length. He argued that survival required flexibility, that China's terrain and conditions demanded adaptation, not imitation, that avoiding decisive battles was not weakness, but strategy. At Zunyi, Mao emerged as the dominant military and political leader. The shift was not immediate nor absolute, but it was irreversible. From this point forward, Mao's approach guided the march. Tactics changed. The Red Army avoided strong points. They divided and regrouped. They crossed where they were least expected. The march continued, across more than 9,000 kilometers, through 11 provinces. By the time the survivors reached the northwest, only a fraction of those who had begun the journey remained. But those who survived had been transformed. The long march became more than an escape. It became a shared ordeal, a crucible that forged loyalty, discipline, and belief. Those who endured it would form the core of the future communist leadership. Their suffering became proof of legitimacy. Their survival became destiny. In later years, the Long March would be remembered not for its defeats, but for its endurance. A myth was born, one rooted in hardship, sacrifice, and survival against impossible odds. Mao's leadership was no longer contested. It was earned. But survival did not mean victory. The march had saved the movement, not the war. And the forces that had nearly destroyed the Red Army were still waiting. In 1937, the war that had consumed China for a decade was abruptly overshadowed by something far worse. The enemy was no longer Chinese. It was Imperial Japan. Tensions had been building for years. Japanese forces already occupied Manchuria. having established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932. Skirmishes along railways and borders were frequent. Diplomacy failed again and again. Then, in July 1937, a clash at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing ignited full-scale war. What followed was not a campaign, it was an invasion. Japanese armies, modernized and battle-hardened, advanced rapidly into northern and eastern China. Nationalist defenses collapsed under the speed and coordination of the assault. Cities fell in succession: Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai. Shanghai became a brutal proving ground. For months, nationalist forces fought street by street against overwhelming firepower. Artillery flattened neighborhoods. Air raids reduced entire districts to rubble. The battle bled both sides, but when it ended, the road to China's capital lay open. In December 1937, Japanese troops entered Nanjing. What followed shocked the world. Over the course of weeks, mass executions, widespread sexual violence, and systematic destruction engulfed the city. Prisoners of war were killed in large numbers. Civilians were targeted indiscriminately. Foreign diplomats and missionaries documented the atrocities. Photographs, diaries, and reports spread beyond China's borders. The scale of violence defied comprehension. For China, it was not just a military defeat, it was a national trauma. The invasion changed everything. The Civil War did not end, but it stopped. Facing an existential threat, Chiang Kai-shek made a decision he had resisted for years. He agreed to cooperate with the Communists. This fragile partnership became known as the Second United Front. The announcement suggested unity. It spoke of national resistance and shared purpose. But the alliance was born of necessity, not trust. The memory of purges, betrayals, and executions was still fresh. Neither side believed the other had abandoned its long-term ambitions. The Nationalists retained control of the central government and the bulk of conventional forces. They bore the brunt of Japan's major offensives, defending cities and transport hubs. The Communists, operating largely behind enemy lines, expanded guerrilla warfare. They sabotaged railways, harassed supply routes, and built influence in occupied rural areas. Both fought Japan. Both watched each other carefully. Even as they coordinated on paper, each side prepared for the war that would follow. For civilians, the invasion brought suffering on an unprecedented scale. Millions fled inland. Refugee columns stretched for kilometers along shattered roads. Famine spread as farmland became battlefields. Bombing raids struck cities far from the front. Factories were dismantled and moved west. Entire communities vanished. The war against Japan became total, and in its shadow, the balance of the Civil War quietly shifted. The nationalist government, burdened by corruption, inflation, and constant retreat, struggled to maintain legitimacy. The Communists, presenting themselves as disciplined and close to the people, steadily expanded their base areas. By the time Japan would eventually be defeated, China would not emerge united. It would emerge exhausted and more divided than ever. The enemy had changed, but the hatred had not. And when the foreign invader was finally gone, the unfinished war between Chinese and Chinese would return, deadlier than before. From 1937 onward, China fought two wars at the same time. One was visible to the world, a nation resisting foreign invasion. The other unfolded quietly, beneath the surface, a struggle for China's future that never truly stopped. Japan's war against China was relentless. Japanese forces controlled the coast, major cities, and key transport lines. Their strategy relied on speed, terror, and overwhelming firepower. When resistance stiffened, retaliation followed. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned. Civilians were executed as warnings. Food supplies were seized or destroyed. The goal was not just conquest. It was submission. The nationalist government bore the brunt of this war. Chiang Kai-shek committed his best divisions to defend major cities and strategic corridors. His armies fought costly battles at Shanghai, Wuhan, and Changsha. Losses were catastrophic. Entire formations were destroyed. Experienced officers were killed. Equipment was irreplaceable. As the Nationalists retreated inland, the government relocated to Chongqing. There, under constant aerial bombardment, it struggled to govern a country at war. Inflation spiraled out of control. Corruption eroded public trust. Conscription grew harsher as manpower shortages worsened. The longer the war dragged on, the more the nationalist state bled. The communists fought differently. Operating largely in Japanese-occupied territory, they avoided set-piece battles. Instead, they waged guerrilla war. Small units sabotaged railways, attacked supply convoys, and vanished into the countryside. Local militias gathered intelligence, provided food, and hid fighters. Japanese reprisals were swift and brutal. For every ambush, entire villages could suffer. Civilians were caught between occupiers and resistance fighters, paying the price for both. Yet this environment favored the communists. They presented themselves as disciplined, restrained, and close to the people. They organized village administrations, redistributed land on a limited scale, and enforced strict codes of conduct. Political indoctrination became as important as military action. Cadres lived among peasants. Meetings explained the purpose of resistance and promised a different future after the war. By the early 1940s, communist-controlled base areas had expanded dramatically. From the remote northwest to regions deep behind Japanese lines, their influence spread through networks of villages rather than cities. Mao Zedong made a deliberate choice. He avoided major confrontations with Japanese forces that could destroy his armies. He prioritized survival, expansion, and political consolidation. Chiang Kai-shek made a different calculation. He believed that preserving the core of his forces was essential for the war that would follow Japan's defeat. He resisted committing all his strength to battles that offered little strategic gain. This decision would haunt him. To many Chinese, it appeared that the Yao nationalists were sacrificing territory while the communists were fighting and organizing among the people. The perception mattered as much as reality. As years passed, the balance shifted quietly. The communists emerged stronger, larger, and more disciplined than they had been in 1937. The nationalists emerged exhausted, indebted, and increasingly isolated. By 1945, when Japan's defeat became inevitable, China stood at a crossroads. The foreign war was ending, but the war within a war, the struggle for China itself, was far from over. Because when Japan falls, the real war returns. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, China did not find peace. It found a vacuum. 8 years of total war had shattered the country. Cities lay in ruins, railways were broken. The economy was exhausted, and the population was armed, politicized, and weary. Into this vacuum stepped the old enemies. The alliance collapsed almost immediately. Negotiations were held, ceasefires were announced. Mediators spoke of compromise and coalition government. But neither side believed the war could truly end without victory. By 1946, the Chinese Civil War resumed in full. The strategic balance appeared, once again, to favor the nationalists. They controlled the recognized central government. They held most major cities, ports, and transportation hubs. They possessed larger armies, heavy weapons, and air power. Internationally, they were acknowledged as China's legitimate rulers. The communists, by contrast, dominated the countryside. They controlled vast rural areas, especially in northern China. Their armies were smaller, but highly disciplined. Their soldiers were politically indoctrinated, accustomed to hardship, and closely tied to local populations. Two Chinas now existed side by side, one urban, bureaucratic, and internationally connected, the other rural, mobilized, and revolutionary. the decisive battleground would be Manchuria. Once occupied by Japan, Manchuria was rich in industry, railways, and resources. At the end of World War II, Soviet forces entered the region, disarming Japanese troops. When the Soviets withdrew, they left behind massive stockpiles of captured weapons. Both Chinese sides rushed to fill the void. Nationalist forces arrived by air and sea, seizing major cities. Communist forces moved through the countryside, surrounding them. Fighting erupted almost immediately. At first, the Nationalists advanced. Using superior firepower, they captured key urban centers and rail lines. But their control was thin, stretched along supply routes vulnerable to attack. The Communists avoided decisive engagements. They cut railways. They isolated garrisons. They absorbed defeated nationalist units and redistributed captured equipment. Crucially, large quantities of Japanese and Soviet-supplied weapons fell into communist hands. Artillery, machine guns, and small arms transformed their forces. For the first time, the communists were no longer just a guerrilla army. They were becoming a conventional one. By 1948, Mao Zedong made a critical decision. After years of avoiding large-scale battles, he committed to full conventional warfare. The Red Army, now reorganized as the People's Liberation Army, would no longer simply harass and encircle. It would destroy entire enemy armies. The turning point came with a series of massive campaigns, the largest fought in Manchuria. The most decisive was the Liaoshen Campaign. Communist forces surrounded major nationalist strongholds, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. Cities were isolated one by one. Attempts to break the encirclement failed. Nationalist commanders hesitated. Orders from central headquarters were delayed or contradictory. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized relief was not coming. Entire armies surrendered. By the end of the campaign, hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops were lost, killed, captured, or defected. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time, the nationalists had not just lost territory, they had lost momentum. The balance of the war flipped. Communist forces surged southward. Rural control translated into strategic depth. Captured weapons fueled further advances. Nationalist cities became isolated islands in a hostile countryside. Confidence drained from the nationalist government. Inflation spiraled. Public support eroded. What had once looked like an inevitable nationalist victory now appeared impossible. By late 1948, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Only its final act remained. The momentum had shifted, and it would never return. By the autumn of 1948, the Chinese Civil War entered its final and most decisive phase. On paper, the nationalist government still appeared powerful. It controlled China's largest cities. It possessed a navy, an air force, and millions of soldiers. It was internationally recognized as the legitimate government of China. But beneath the surface, its strength was hollow. Years of war had drained the economy. Hyperinflation had wiped out savings in the cities. Morale inside the army collapsed under corruption, poor logistics, and exhausted leadership. Across the countryside, the balance of power had already shifted. The communists now controlled vast rural regions, secure supply networks, and an army hardened by decades of continuous fighting. They no longer fought only as guerrillas. They were ready for decisive battle. That battle came on the plains of eastern China, in what would become known as the Huaihai Campaign. Between November 1948 and January 1949, more than 1 million soldiers converged on a region of railways, villages, and farmland stretching across Jiangsu, Anhui, and Shandong provinces. The Nationalist High Command committed its best remaining forces to hold the area. They believed that controlling Huaihai meant controlling access to central China. The communists saw something else. They saw an opportunity to destroy the nationalist army in the field. Using coordinated movements, communist forces encircled nationalist units one by one. Rail lines were cut. Supply convoys were intercepted. Relief attempts failed repeatedly. Entire nationalist armies found themselves trapped, without food, without ammunition, and without clear orders. Inside the encirclements, chaos spread. Commanders waited for reinforcements that never arrived. Soldiers deserted in large numbers. Others surrendered en masse. The scale of the defeat was catastrophic. More than 500,000 nationalist troops were killed, captured, or defected during the campaign. Elite units ceased to exist. The backbone of the nationalist army was shattered beyond repair. For Chiang Kai-shek, the psychological toll was devastating. He increasingly distrusted his own generals. He centralized decisions, then reversed them. Orders contradicted one another. Some commanders chose survival over loyalty. Others defected outright, bringing entire formations with them. Chiang found himself isolated, commanding on paper an army that no longer obeyed him. After Huaihai, there was no realistic path to recovery. The communists advanced south with momentum that could not be stopped. In April 1949, they crossed the Yangtze River, a natural barrier that had protected dynasties for centuries. Nationalist defenses collapsed almost immediately. Cities surrendered without resistance. Garrisons melted away. The psychological weight of inevitability crushed any remaining will to fight. In the north, Beijing, then called Beiping, changed hands without a battle. Negotiated surrender spared the city from destruction. What years of war had failed to achieve was now accomplished through exhaustion and certainty. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Chiang Kai-shek prepared to flee the mainland, relocating his government and remaining forces to Taiwan. He left behind a country that had already slipped from his grasp. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The Civil War was over, not because every battle had been fought, but because the final campaigns had destroyed the possibility of reversal. By the time Chiang fled, the war had already decided his fate. China had been remade, not through a single victory, but through endurance, adaptation, and the collapse of all alternatives. In October 1949, the war finally ends. From the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China. The announcement is brief. The symbolism is absolute. After more than 2 decades of civil war, invasion, and revolution, a new state is born. For the Communist Party, victory is total. The nationalist government has fled across the Taiwan Strait. Its armies are shattered. Its authority on the mainland has vanished. But the end of fighting does not mean the end of suffering. China emerges from the war devastated. Decades of conflict have left the economy in ruins. Railways are destroyed. Factories stand idle. Inflation has wiped out personal savings in the cities. In the countryside, farmland has been repeatedly stripped bare by marching armies. The human cost is staggering. Historians estimate that tens of millions of people died between 1927 and 1949, from combat, executions, famine, disease, and displacement. Entire generations have known nothing but war. Families are fragmented across borders. Villages are missing whole age groups of men. The psychological scars of violence run deep. Victory brings power, but also responsibility. The new communist leadership inherits a nation exhausted and traumatized. It faces the task of rebuilding while preventing the return of the chaos that nearly destroyed it. For Mao and his inner circle, the lesson of the Civil War is clear. They believe compromise invites collapse. That divided authority leads to warlordism. That ideological weakness opens the door to enemies, both foreign and domestic. As a result, the new state moves quickly to consolidate control. Political opponents are eliminated. Independent organizations are dissolved. Power is centralized in the party, the army, and the state. Land reform begins, reshaping rural China, often violently. Campaigns are launched to root out counter-revolutionaries. The tools of wartime mobilization are repurposed for governance. The revolution, once a movement of survival, becomes a system of rule. And even in victory, the costs continue. The men who fought for decades do not step away from struggle. They move from battlefields to campaigns. Political, economic, ideological. The habits of war persist. Suspicion becomes policy. Unity is enforced. Dissent is treated as a threat to national survival. The winners have won everything. And in doing so, they have bound themselves to the very methods that carried them to power. China is unified once again. But it is unified through force, memory, and fear of returning to the past. The Civil War is over. Yet its legacy shapes every institution, every decision, and every boundary that follows. Because the revolution was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The Chinese Civil War did not end in 1949. It simply changed form. When the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, the fighting stopped. But the lessons of the war were absorbed deeply into the new state. Modern China is governed by a single party not by accident, but by experience. The Communist Party that emerged victorious had survived purges, encirclement, invasion, and near destruction. Its leaders did not believe power could be shared safely. They believed division led to chaos, and chaos led to national collapse. One-party rule was not presented as ideology alone. It was presented as a safeguard against a return to war. Every major institution of modern China reflects this legacy. Political unity is prioritized over pluralism. Stability is treated as a strategic necessity. Dissent is viewed not simply as disagreement, but as potential fragmentation. The military doctrine of the People's Republic was shaped directly by the Civil War. The People's Liberation Army was not built as a neutral national force, but as an army of the party. Politically loyal, ideologically trained, and deeply integrated into society. This structure emerged from decades of guerrilla warfare, mass mobilization, and survival against superior enemies. It explains why political education remains central to China's armed forces, and why the military sees itself not just as a defender of borders, but as a guardian of the state's political system. The war also left China permanently divided. When the Nationalist government retreated to Taiwan in 1949, the Civil War froze rather than concluded. No peace treaty was ever signed. Two governments emerged, each claiming legitimacy, each shaped by the same conflict, separated by a narrow stretch of water and an unresolved history. The Taiwan question is not a modern dispute. It is the unfinished business of a civil war. Every crisis across the Taiwan Strait echoes decisions made decades earlier. Every military exercise, every diplomatic standoff, carries the memory of a war that never formally ended. Beyond China's borders, the Civil War reshaped global politics. Its outcome altered the balance of power in Asia. It transformed the early Cold War. It influenced conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. A once divided, weakened China emerged as a unified revolutionary state aligned against Western influence. This forced new alliances, new strategies, and new fears, many of which still shape Asia-Pacific security today. Even China's relationship with the outside world reflects Civil War lessons. Suspicion of foreign intervention, resistance to external pressure, a belief that strength, not compromise, ensures survival. These are not abstract principles. They were learned through decades of invasion, betrayal, and internal conflict. And the most enduring lesson of all is this: civil wars do not truly end. They imprint themselves on institutions, borders, and collective memory. They shape how nations define enemies, both foreign and internal. They influence how power is used, defended, and justified. The Chinese Civil War created modern China, but it also ensured that the past would never fully release its grip on the present. Because civil wars are not finished when the guns fall silent. They evolve. China was not forged in peace, but in survival. For more than 2 decades, the land was consumed by war, by battles, purges, retreats, and invasions. Millions died, cities burned, families were uprooted. Yet from the chaos emerged a new nation, a state built on endurance, discipline, and the memory of nearly impossible survival. A government that demanded loyalty, forged authority, and reshaped the very definition of Chinese power. But as we reflect on this history, one question remains: was this war inevitable? Was China destined to be torn apart by ideology, ambition, and foreign invasion? Or was it merely the least bad outcome? A brutal path through which one vision of China ultimately triumphed? The answers are not simple. The consequences are still with us today. In the one-party system that governs the mainland, in the military doctrines shaped by decades of struggle, in the unresolved question of Taiwan, and in the balance of power across the Asia-Pacific. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And as we turn the page, the story continues.